666.
My one big thing this week is we recently had an awesome interview with Fahad Nazer, who's spokesperson for the Saudi embassy. Fahad is the guy who answers questions to the media on pretty much any topic that's Saudi related. So when we interviewed him, we had a chance to sort of ask him some tough but fair questions about a host of issues. One of the tougher questions we asked him was about how he overcomes skepticism about Saudi Arabia. And here's what Fahad said.
The changes are happening so fast that you can, if you spend a month, for instance, you can see them unfold right before your eyes. That certainly has been my experience. So when I was there last week, there were a couple of delegations. I was actually accompanying one of them. There was a business delegation from Colorado. Most of them had never been to the kingdom. And it is I think that's the most gratifying part of my job, is that first 24 hours I spend with delegations, especially those who've never been to the kingdom. Once they soak things in, they look around, they talk to Saudis, and without being prompted or without me asking them, they come up to me on their own and say, we had no idea that this is going on in Saudi Arabia. We have heard so much about Saudi Arabia and read so much about it, but what we've read and heard has been just a snapshot, often just not an accurate picture, not an accurate depiction. Reality is so much different. It is so much more positive.
So this answer is really excellent. It made me think about my perceptions of Saudi Arabia before I went for the first time. I remember my friends and family telling me specifically to be careful, as if Saudi Arabia were dangerous or unsafe. All they knew about Saudi Arabia is what they had seen in media, like Jamie Foxx's The Kingdom and films and everything. And I just remember getting to Saudi Arabia and being like, wow, this is actually completely different than I had even seen in like any of the research writing, working with Sustig that I'd ever seen. And it was actually fun. And that was sort of like when I was thinking about Fahad talking about his answer about hosting Americans over in Saudi Arabia and having them say to him, man, this is like completely different than I ever imagined, even with seeing images and videos and everything. We talk about the kingdom a lot on this podcast until we're blue in the face. But seeing it for yourself is kind of just unlike anything you can experience online or reading about it. This exact sentiment was echoed recently and chronicled by Diana Lauderhouse, who wrote for Deadline this week about her experiences visiting Saudi Arabia for the first time for the Red Sea Film Festival, which looks awesome. That's my one big thing this week, visit Saudi. If I could ask you, do you guys remember your first time visit? I mean, I know, Richard, you grew up there, but Robert, actually, let me ask you, do you remember your first time visiting Saudi in the region and sort of your perceptions about how what you saw on the ground and how they matched up with what you thought about it beforehand?
Absolutely. I was actually a master's student at the University of Oxford, and I traveled out there on a consulting gig, first to the capital, Riyadh, and then on a separate trip out to Jeddah. So I was working at the time with private sector companies in Saudi Arabia. And to tell you the truth, even at that time, I mean, early on, well before Mohammed bin Salman came onto the scene and started, embarked on this very ambitious social and economic transformation, of which I think the social component has been, particularly easy to visible and easy to identify. I actually saw a lot of these changes beginning to take place, even in the workplaces at that time, 2014, 2015. I mean, women in the workplace, especially in private sector firms, there were, men and women working together in the same workspace. So, but I mean, again, it was not as visible, not as apparent as it is today, but it was the beginning of this transformation. From my understanding, I have not been to Saudi Arabia in some time, mostly because of the coronavirus. But everything that we're hearing about Saudi Arabia is that transformation is just tremendous. And that much of the country as we know it, and many people who have been longtime observers say there are some parts we don't even recognize anymore. mostly for the better. There are some, of course, there's some criticisms too, but just a place that's undergoing a tremendous amount of change.
So I didn't grow up. I first lived in Saudi in the 80s when I was much, much younger. And then after doing my master's at Hopkins, and then when I was executive director with the Middle East Policy Council for over a decade, and it was in and out of Saudi Arabia once or twice a year all the time, and then spent extended time over there, and to what Robert was saying about the sense of things, and typically when you'd come in, and I was aware of this, I dealt with Western educated, very articulate English-speaking Saudis, which is a subset in Saudi Arabia, and you have to understand the larger picture. But this community, this segment of society was thinking very much along these things. Everything was, very forward-thinking. And I've found over the years that the Saudis are thinking about a lot of things going to the future in terms of what they need to do economically, socially, well before they actually have an opportunity to realize them. And one of the triggers of this change now is what I've always said, is that social change, the things that women driving, the Vision 2030, these are all going to be driven by economic imperatives, which is what's happened. Significant sectors of society, and especially the youth now, we're ready for this. So for me, I agree 100%. What you're saying, what Fahad's saying is, if you don't believe it, you really should go to see, because it is real. But for me, it's sort of been an arc over a long 30-year period that is really accelerated and is especially fascinating now. But you can see the impulse and the instincts and the desire and the aspirations, well back, as Robert said, well back a decade ago. So to see it coming together and see real change, and it is real change. Remember, this is a country that whose motto was progress without change. In some ways other countries do that, but this was, progress without change. And the fact is they discovered they're not going to achieve progress without some change, and that's what we're seeing now.